Good afternoon, everyone. This is Robin Wilson from Brock Solutions. I'd like to start by welcoming everybody to our third of 4 webinar sessions as part of our lead up to the IndustryWeek show. I hope you've been able to catch the first 2 sessions in our series on demystifying manufacturing IT and getting started with your manufacturing IT. Today I'll be building on these 2 previous sessions and getting into manufacturing IT implementation. Now before I get started, I just wanted to go over some of the logistics for this presentation. I'll try and keep the content to about 20 to 25 minutes so we can leave some time for questions at the end. Now to deliver questions, you can either use the chat box on your screen, or at the end of the slide presentation, we'll be opening up the phone lines for questions as well. So right now, everybody else except for me is muted. So again, my name is Robin, and I'm a consultant here and a client leader at Brock Solutions. And I've been working in the real-time MES and automation space with our manufacturing customers here at Brock for 12 years. So we often get asked about a methodology for MES rollout. So today I'm going to discuss an implementation methodology built on industry best practices for enterprise rollouts of MES. But first, I thought I'd take a step back to level set on the space we'll be discussing today. So what I have here is a drawing of a typical environment when it comes to a manufacturing enterprise. So at the bottom, levels 1 and 2 is the automation system. So your PLCs, your HMIs, and your devices on the plant floor. On the opposite end is level 4, which covers your typical ERP functions. And the space for the focus of this webinar is the MES, or the MOM layer, and sometimes referred to as the manufacturing IT layer. And this really lives in between those 2 layers. So I'm showing some typical functions that exist in this layer. And really what it's doing is acting as the glue between the plant floor level and the ERP. So through this presentation, I'll be walking through a practical MES playbook or methodology. So at a high level, you can understand how MES programs can be tackled. As I go through this, I'll be highlighting critical steps in the process where best practices should be leveraged. So in looking at enterprise rollouts, there's often a hurdle that customers have around how to get started. And a great place to start is a framework study, which is going to answer some of the key questions necessary for moving forward on this manufacturing IT implementation journey. So the framework study is going to answer or help to answer some of the typical heavy hitter questions. So what's the future state of MES for my business? How are we going to drive business value, and what are those requirements that are going to help us do that? What's the solution architecture that fits the needs and is aligned with your sustainment goals? And it also provides clarity around what goes where. So in that diagram, what functions should reside in the ERP layer, what should be in the MES layer, and what should be in your automation layer. Another thing that's important when moving forward with a manufacturing IT implementation is what's the business case and what is the expected ROI? And also coming out of a typical framework study is what is the long-term enterprise roadmap? So how does that rollout going to look? What does the schedule look like? And how are you going to go about that journey? So after the completion of the framework study, it's typical to move into a functional specification phase. Now, traditionally, this often used to consist of writing really long narratives, so 500 pages, 1,000 pages, but this often led to confusion amongst different stakeholder groups depending on their technical backgrounds. A lot of times it could be difficult as well to get stakeholder groups to review a 1,000-page document, so the review cycles and the necessary attention to the review just wasn't there. So a great way to alleviate that is to define and align the requirements using a graphical or a workflow methodology. So the heart of this functional specification phase is developing the detailed workflows that are capturing the MES requirements, the use cases, maybe some basic prototype screens, as well as defining all the related integration points. So how is MES going to interface with your ERP system? How's it going to talk to your controls and automation layer? And how's it going to talk to external systems like LIMS or a warehouse management system? Now, when you're looking at MES rollouts, this phase should typically span several representative sites to confirm that the workflows and use cases are indeed aligned across the organization, and they're going to be leverageable for future sites. So this is a sample of a typical workflow. The workflow is divided into swim lanes, which depict the various layers of the manufacturing environment. So at the bottom, we have the physical layer, followed by the automation layer, then the MES layer. We have a layer in there for other level 3 systems, and then finally the ERP layer at the top. Now I want to focus in on this MES layer. Each box on the workflow is a step in the process, and it's indicated by what we call a use case. So here we have a use case for creating material WIP, and you can see there's a couple of requirements that come with that. One is the use case itself, and the other is a user interface. We can see the little hand scanner icon here. So what I'm showing here is the actual use case itself. So a description of what it is, how it's triggered, what some variations are if you're looking at multiple sites, and also the steps that are actually executed to go through when this use case is being executed. Here's the actual prototype of the hand scanner screen that would be used and associated with this use case. So this is what the operator would actually be using to create the material WIP. Now, best practice here that can be used is to early on map these use cases to all of the necessary test cases that can be used during unit, integrated, and factory acceptance testing. So what I'm showing here is just the user interface that can be used to create these test cases. So using this best practice, it can be verified that every one of the requirements of the use case has been met, and it can also be tracked to see if it's passed or failed. So after completion and sign-off of the functional specification, typical next step is to move into the detailed design phase, where a good place to start is by mapping the requirements that came out of the functional specification phase to the MES software product that was selected. At the beginning of this phase, it's important to develop a detailed schedule that can be used where you split out the development tasks. For large deployments, it's a good idea to organize the schedule around something like development sprints. So the development sprints, at the beginning of the sprint, you would be reviewing with the customer what's going to come up in that sprint. And at the end of the sprint, you would present to the customer all of the functions that are now operational, show that they've passed all their test cases. And something that's important here is to have frequent communication and engagement with the customer. You want to make sure that your expectations maintain aligned and that you're also sticking with your schedule. And this allows for some readjustments if necessary. But having that frequent communication with the customer is very important, because you don't want to get to the end of your development phase and have to do some drastic changes. And as we look at development, I should take a step back and talk a little bit about the maturity of the MES market. So most of the major players in this market have rounded out their service offerings through acquisition. And as I'm presenting this, I'm not trying to take anything away from the software vendors, but there are some gaps when it comes to, the traditional pure software development. And that's okay though, because there's some external tools that you can use to fill in these gaps. But I did want to talk about them because I think it's important to be aware of them and aware of what some of those gaps are with the software products. And these can help you ensure successful deployments of your MES solutions. So right off the bat, most of the major players and major software providers don't have version control on their software. So using an external product can help support multi-developer environments and provide code version management. Review Board is a code quality tool that basically requires developers to check in their code as completed and ready for review. Then you can have a team of software developers that can highlight right in the code itself anything that either doesn't meet the requirements from the workflow or the associated test cases that were developed, or doesn't align with coding standards. Now, when you look at MES systems are meant to be the glue, as I said, between your controls layer and your ERP layer and other systems. So what we found in the past is a lot of times when you get to site, a big component of the commissioning phase, and one of the things that most people struggle with, is getting all the systems to talk to each other. So having an MES message simulation tool allows you to test all of those interfaces on the bench before you go to site. It can be tailored to the needs of the MES project, and it can work with all of the major software vendors. So you're basically testing out all those system interfaces. For load testing, you want to make sure that the application that you're developing has a good sound architecture around it. And obviously all architectures have limits. You can beef up your architecture and have more memory and have more data storage, but you really want to make sure ahead of time and early on that that architecture is going to support your application. So having a system to load and create test data, you can make sure that you're going to have an architecture that's going to support your application, and you can also see how much leftover processing power and how much leftover memory you have for future improvements. For continuous integration, this is a tool that you can use to basically for regression testing. So it can automatically test any code being submitted, and it can map the effects of those changes and prepare the necessary test cases. So anything that code is going to touch, it'll tell you what code it's going to touch and what things you actually have to retest from your test cases that you developed earlier. Now, when it comes to deployment, I should talk a little bit here about multiple environments. So normally you don't just have a production environment where your system is going to run. Normally you have a development environment, you may have a QA environment as well. And something that is a little bit tricky right now, and there's no great way to do it for the major software vendors, is to move your application from one environment to another. So coming up with an automated deployment tool, you can automate this process, and it takes away a lot of the manual steps that you have to either merge or migrate databases or rules or functionality. So this really helps streamline the development effort. And as you get later on in something like a rollout or different phases of the project, it's really interesting how many times you're going to be migrating code from your development to your QA to your production environment, and also migrating the production environment back so you make sure you have everything that's in production as well as some data for testing. And finally, you want to have a detailed tasking and issue tracking tool. So this is a great way to manage your development. It facilitates the coordination of large teams, allows you to raise issues and escalate issues. And once you've actually gone live, it can be opened up to the customer itself, and they can raise issues as well. So from a customer standpoint, you want to make sure that facility is available for you. Now, once the development is complete, you want to move into the testing and simulation phase. So a great thing to do here is actually to set up a fully integrated functional environment, which is going to use simulation. So here is where it's important to go back and go through all of those comprehensive test plans that were created for each use case. For fully integrated testing, you want to use simulation tools to mimic the other systems, such as your controls and your ERP and LIMS, to ensure that the solution actually works with all the systems. So this is taking it a step beyond just simulating those messages going back. This is where you can actually see the full function of the system. So as an example, you might want to simulate ERP creating an order and sending that down to MES. Your MES system can process the order, it'll start the execution of that order, and maybe that involves sending recipes down to the controls layer. So that message would be sent down to the controls layer. Then you can simulate the controls layer actually doing something and sending back information to MES, like material consumptions, inventory moves, things like that. So MES will then grab that message from the controls layer, and then it'll aggregate the data and send the necessary information back to ERP. So you can actually do the whole flow of how your system is going to work in this simulated environment. And after the integrated testing is complete, it's a good idea for the customer to go to the actual facility where the application is being developed, so whether it's a system integrator or your software provider that's doing it for you, and actually take part in a fully functional factory acceptance test. So typically, a core team of people from the customer would go to the site and take part in this. But it's a really great idea, and we found it to be a best practice to actually send some operators as well. So the operators can come up, they can get a look and feel for the system. It lets them buy into it and take ownership in the system. And we found that can be very successful to have that knowledge and have them using the system before it comes to them on site. So basically in the factory acceptance testing, you're validating that everything works. You're going back to all of those test cases and the functional tests so that you can validate the solution works before you deploy it to site. So the next thing that comes after you have the sign-off of the factory acceptance test document is the deployment to site. So again, using those automated deployment tools to push your code to either the QA or the production environment. And then you want to go through a site acceptance testing. And basically this is should be a very similar process to the factory acceptance test. Only now you're working with those real external systems, so the real controls layer and the real ERP layer, instead of the simulated systems in the test environment. And after the site acceptance test, it's a really great idea to have a stabilization and support period where your system integrator, your ERP people, your controls people, they're all on site. So typically, your system integrator or software provider will be working to aid in operator transition and also in issue resolution. As I said before, MES go lives are typically part of a much larger implementation, and a lot of times there's other systems going live simultaneously. So it's important to have resources on the ground to help clean things up if necessary and keep production running. So a recent example where we did have an MES go live, there was a go live with the ERP system as well. And we are seeing some issues with orders coming down to the MES layer. So this was causing some errors in some material consumptions and tracking. But having the boots on the ground, we were able to capture this and work with the ERP teams to fix the problem, get some more training for how to actually fix it, and then making sure that we cleaned up any data that wasn't there or shouldn't have been there. This stabilization and support period is also a really great training opportunity for the customer. So you can work with the resources from your software provider, from your system integrator, and not only learn how the system works, but also learn how to troubleshoot and get through issue resolution. Because the best way to learn is to actually do. So this is a great opportunity to do that in the stabilization and support period. Now after the completion, I call it a pilot here. I don't like using the word pilot, but say it was called Site 1. For the second site, you typically want to follow the same project approach as the first. And a best practice here is to do one more site on its own, kind of in series fashion. But this one you should be able to do on a much tighter time frame with a smaller team. So as you can see here on this slide, by having the foresight from the get-go, when we said you're looking at a rollout, so take a couple representative sites, you can make sure that a lot of the use cases and user interfaces and the code that's been developed is leverageable for the second site and future sites after that. So this is really what's leading to that schedule acceleration and the cost reductions. And following that second site, once you've validated your methodology, you validated your approach, you validated that the solution is working, you can really start accelerating even further and doing implementations for subsequent sites in parallel to meet your timeline. For major rollouts, when you're looking at 10 or 50 or 100 sites, you don't want each site taking a huge block of time, or it may, but if you do all that in series, it's going to take years and years and years. And a lot of times this is something that you want to implement, say, over a 3-year or a 5-year roadmap. So how do you do that? And that's when you get into these parallel site deployments, just to keep with your timeline. So something I haven't really talked about yet, and it's really important, and I left it to the end on purpose, but something that you need to keep in mind right from the get-go is how are you going to support and sustain this system once you've gone live. So I wanted to talk briefly about this, as it is a critical piece to all implementations, and it's not just something you should think of after the fact or after you've done your first site or your second site. So on all MES projects and programs, you should have something like this set up. It could be as simple as having your system integrator carry a pager, or having a more comprehensive full-time on-site sustainment management team. In either case, it's recommended that you have a sustainment model for MES projects that follows the ITIL methodology, which is represented in this image. So as an example from Brock, for some customers we provide all of these functions, and for others we only do a small slice. It really depends on the customer's business model and what their goals are and what they want to insource versus what they want to outsource. So I'm not going to dive into this too much, but I thought this would be a nice teaser for next week's webinar, which is titled Support and Sustainment. And with that, I'm just going to put up a slide here about Brock Solutions, who we are and what we do. I don't want to dive into this. What I'd rather do is open up the floor to questions. So we're going to unmute the mics, and if anybody has any questions that they want to enter in the chat box, now is the time for those. So thank you. Oh, I see a question coming up in the chat box here. When is the IndustryWeek show? Okay, the IndustryWeek show is May 3rd to 5th in Chicago. This is a great event that we've taken part in the last number of years. It's being co-sponsored by MESA International. And MESA is a not-for-profit group of software providers, system integrators, and customers that are really dedicated to improving the space around MES. Okay, I have another question here. Was the number of use cases on your example slide typical? I don't exactly remember how many I had on there. That one did look a little bit busy to me. It really depends on the function that you're trying to solve. So sometimes we may only have 3 to 4 use cases on a workflow, and sometimes they are a little bit more busy, like the one that I did have there. I hope that answers your question, John. And how many FTEs on a typical project? Really, that I hate to say it depends, but it really does depend. Depending on what the rollout strategy of the customer is, and this is something that's usually determined, as I said, in the framework study, what does that look like? Sometimes they decide to go a big bang approach with doing a full implementation of all the MES functions on one facility. It might be a very large facility. You might have a team of 15 to 30 FTEs doing that deployment. Another example I can think of is we just chose to roll out, worked with our customer to determine that recipe management was the most important piece that they needed to roll out right at the beginning to fit in with their ERP rollout. So that team that we had was, I believe it was 3 to start with, and then once we started rolling out, we were down to about 1.5 FTEs. And how many, another follow-up here, it says, and how many from Brock? So there's a number of different approaches that your system integrator can take. At Brock specifically, a lot of times we try and have most of the FTEs, obviously, from our own company, but we also find it's very important to have either a consultant or a consultant developer from the software provider as part of the team too. So this gives not only somebody with a really strong in-depth product knowledge, but it also ties back into the software provider's development organization. So keeping in line and allowing that feedback loop. So what does the software product offer today, and are there improvements or suggested features that the customer would like to see that aren't part of their current product offering? That provides the feedback loop into the development organization. So we found that to be very successful, is having a bit of a mixed team. We've also done some implementations where we're teaming up, and it might be half from Brock and half from the software provider. It really depends on a number of factors. Oh, John just said, good tip, thanks. Sorry for calling you out on that, John, but thank you. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for listening. I hope you found that valuable. There's some more links on our website if you'd like to gather some more information and reach out. And I recommend anybody that's not registered for the IndustryWeek conference. It's a very valuable conference and something that we put a lot of effort into. And any customers that we either meet there or that come there that we know, they've all commented about the value of that conference. It's a great show, so I recommend checking it out.